Picture this: a king on horseback, alone on a ridge, the sun low and brutal over the fields of Leicestershire. Around him, the screams of dying men, the thunder of hooves, the crash of steel on steel. His army is collapsing. His allies have betrayed him. The battle is lost, and every man who serves him knows it. But the king does not retreat. He pulls his visor down. He lowers his lance. And he charges not away from the enemy, but directly toward the man who wants his crown. Directly toward Henry Tudor, surrounded by hundreds of bodyguards. Directly into the mouth of death itself. His knights beg him to flee. He refuses. There are horses ready. Roads are clear. He could be gone before anyone caught him. He refuses. Instead, Richard III, King of England, Lord of the realm, last of the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled for over 3 centuries, drives his spurs into his horse's flanks and screams a war cry that cuts above the noise of 10,000 men killing each other. He is going to end this, or he is going to die trying. And on this warm August morning in 1485, at a place called Bosworth Field, one of the most astonishing, heartbreaking, and electrifying final stands in all of English history is about to unfold. Welcome. If you are new to this channel, please do consider subscribing. We bring you stories like this every week, stories of kings and warriors, of empires won and lost in a single afternoon. Today, we go back to the end of the Middle Ages, to a man history has misunderstood, maligned, and sometimes deliberately distorted. Today, we tell the full truth about Richard III, who he was, what he built, what he believed, and why, in the final moments of his life, he chose to die as a king rather than live as a fugitive. To understand Bosworth, you must first understand the world that made Richard. He was born on October 2, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, a woman of fierce intelligence and immovable pride whom contemporaries called the Rose of Raby. The England into which Richard entered was not a peaceful realm. It was a country tearing itself apart. The Wars of the Roses, that long, grinding civil war between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, had already begun to poison everything. Loyalties shifted like sand. Noblemen who were allies at breakfast were enemies by nightfall. And the crown itself had come to feel less like a divine inheritance and more like a prize to be seized by whoever was ruthless enough to take it. Richard was 7 years old when his father was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460. The Duke of York's head was placed on the gates of the city of York, crowned with a paper crown in cruel mockery of his ambitions. Richard's older brother Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was killed the same day, cut down at a bridge, still a teenager, begging for mercy he never received. It was a lesson Richard absorbed deep in his bones. Mercy, in this world, was a luxury. Survival required something harder. But it was his eldest surviving brother, Edward, who would change everything. Tall, charismatic, and ferocious in battle, Edward of York swept through England in 1461, defeated the Lancastrian forces, and had himself crowned King Edward IV at the age of 18. Richard, now 8 years old, was suddenly the brother of a king. He was sent north to Middleham Castle in Yorkshire to be educated in the household of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, a man so powerful they called him the Kingmaker. In that northern castle, Richard was forged. He trained in arms. He learned horsemanship, swordsmanship, the management of men. He studied the law, the obligations of lordship, the rituals of the church. He was small for his age, and accounts suggest he suffered from scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that would have made the brutal physical training of a medieval knight genuinely painful. And yet he trained harder than his peers, as if he had something to prove. As if the deaths of his father and brother had settled something cold and resolute inside him that would never quite thaw. He also fell in love. And Neville, daughter of the Kingmaker himself, became Richard's wife. Theirs was a marriage that began in political calculation. Her inheritance was vast, her family connections crucial, but by all accounts it became something more. Richard was, by temperament, a loyal man. He was loyal to his brother Edward, loyal to the north of England that became his base of power, and loyal, in ways that would prove both admirable and catastrophic, to his own sense of what was right. As Edward IV consolidated his reign and then, after a brief Lancastrian restoration in 1470, reconsolidated it again by force of arms, Richard proved himself an indispensable commander. At the Battle of Barnet in April 1471, he led the right flank of the Yorkist army through the fog and chaos of one of the bloodiest mornings of the entire Civil War. He was 18 years old. He did not flinch. A month later, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he fought again, and the Lancastrian cause was destroyed. Their prince, Edward of Westminster, died on the field. The long nightmare of the Wars of the Roses appeared, finally, to be over. Richard was granted the lordship of the North. He became the king's lieutenant, governing the vast territories above the River Trent with a combination of firmness, genuine fairness, and personal presence that made him genuinely popular among the northern gentry and common people. He held councils. He settled disputes. He built. He was particularly concerned with the administration of justice, a passion that would mark his brief kingship. In the north, they loved him. They called him, in their northern dialect, their good lord. When they heard, years later, that he had fallen at Bosworth, many of them wept. And then, in April 1483, everything changed in the space of a single fortnight. Edward IV, who had grown fat and dissolute in his middle years, a man who had once been the most formidable warrior in England, now more comfortable at banquets than in armor, died suddenly at the age of 40. He was not yet 41. The cause is uncertain. Some say a fever. Some suggest a stroke. Whatever the cause, he left behind him a vacuum, and into that vacuum all the old violence of the Wars of the Roses began immediately to flood. Edward's heir was his 12-year-old son, also Edward, Prince of Wales, soon to be Edward V. But the boy king was surrounded by the powerful family of his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, a clan that Richard deeply distrusted and that many of the old nobility despised. The Woodvilles moved quickly to consolidate power around the young king. Richard moved faster. What followed, the events of the spring and summer of 1483, remains the most controversial chapter of Richard's life, the period most debated by historians, and the period that gave rise to the darkest accusations against him. He intercepted the young king and his escorts at Stony Stratford. He had the leading Woodvilles arrested. He had himself appointed Lord Protector. He moved Edward V into the Tower of London, at that time a royal residence as much as a prison, alongside Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. And then, in late June 1483, he had Parliament declare his brother Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, on grounds that Edward had allegedly been precontracted to another woman before the marriage. If the marriage was invalid, the children were illegitimate. If the children were illegitimate, the throne had no heir. And if there was no heir, there was another surviving son of the House of York. On July 6, 1483, Richard III was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent, the preparations meticulous. He rode through London draped in purple cloth of gold. The crowds cheered, though whether from genuine enthusiasm or the pragmatic instinct of a population that had seen enough war to know which way to applaud, we cannot say for certain. The princes in the Tower, young Edward and his brother Richard, were seen less and less frequently after the summer of 1483. Eventually, they disappeared from sight entirely. Their fate remains, to this day, one of history's most debated mysteries. Were they killed on Richard's orders? Were they smuggled out of England? Did they die of illness? We do not know. We likely never will. What we can say is that their disappearance was politically catastrophic for Richard. It became the wound in his reign that never healed, the whisper that followed him everywhere, the accusation that stripped him of allies and handed his enemies the most powerful weapon imaginable. But in between the scandal and the catastrophe, Richard actually governed well. It is an irony that history does not always advertise. He was one of the first English kings to have parliamentary statutes written in English rather than Latin, so that ordinary people could understand the laws that governed them. He established the Council of the North to provide better governance to the region he knew best. He reformed the courts to make justice more accessible to the poor. He abolished the system of benevolences, forced loans the crown extracted from wealthy subjects, a reform that made him genuinely popular among the merchant class. His legal reforms were so respected that some of them outlasted him by generations. None of it was enough to save him. In the autumn of 1483, even before Richard had been king 6 months, his most powerful ally, the Duke of Buckingham, turned against him and raised a rebellion. It failed, and Buckingham was captured and executed. But it revealed the fragility of Richard's support among the nobility. More dangerously, it pushed the opposition toward a Welsh-born, largely obscure claimant who had spent most of his life in exile in Brittany and France, nursing the slenderest of claims to the Lancastrian inheritance. His name was Henry Tudor. Henry was, by most accounts, a cautious, cold-blooded, and intelligent man. He had spent his youth as a hostage and his adulthood as a refugee. He had almost nothing except ambition and a group of exiled Englishmen desperate for a way home. But he had one extraordinary asset. He was the last viable alternative to Richard III. And as Richard's reign grew more embattled, his beloved wife and dying of tuberculosis in March 1485, whispers swirling that Richard himself had poisoned her to free himself for a political remarriage, whispers that forced Richard into the indignity of a public denial, Henry Tudor waded across the Channel and gathered his forces. He landed at Milford Haven on the coast of Wales on August 1, 1485, with roughly 2,000 French mercenaries and a collection of English exiles. He marched through Wales, gathering Welsh supporters as he went. His presence in England was an open gamble. Richard had the larger army, the legitimate crown, and the resources of the state. But Richard was hemorrhaging allies. The most powerful was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, whose enormous retinue could tip any battle. Stanley was Henry Tudor's stepfather. His loyalties were opaque to everyone, including, fatally, Richard. Richard had summoned his nobles to join him. Some came. Many found excuses. He gathered an army at Nottingham, then marched south and west to intercept Henry. By the evening of August 21, 1485, the two forces were within a few miles of each other, near the market town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard made camp on Ambion Hill, high ground, tactically sound. He had perhaps 10,000 men. Henry had perhaps 5,000 to 8,000, but his rear was protected by Lord Stanley's force of several thousand men, sitting at a watchful distance, ready to join whichever side seemed most likely to win. The night before the battle, various chronicles tell us, Richard slept poorly. Some accounts describe him as restless, troubled by dreams. Whether or not we accept the dreams, later embellished dramatically by Tudor propagandists, the sleeplessness is entirely plausible. He was a man who understood, with clear-eyed precision, exactly how much was at stake. He wrote letters that night to various nobles, imploring them to come. He knew that the battle the next morning could not be won by the army he had. He needed Stanley. In the morning, before the armies engaged, Richard sent a message to Lord Stanley. Join him now, or Richard would execute Stanley's son, George, whom Richard held as a hostage. Stanley's reply was essentially that he had other sons. The hostage was not executed. Perhaps Richard could not bring himself to do it. Perhaps he calculated it would harden Stanley against him. But the message was clear. Stanley would not move. The battle began in the mid-morning. Richard's vanguard, commanded by John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, advanced against Henry's forces. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Norfolk was killed, a serious blow. Henry's forces held. And then, watching from Ambion Hill, Richard saw something that made his heart quicken with a terrible combination of hope and desperation. Henry Tudor himself, accompanied by only a small bodyguard, had moved away from the main body of his army. He was riding toward Lord Stanley's position, presumably to confer, to plead, to secure those crucial thousands of men. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the pretender to Richard's throne was exposed, relatively unprotected, in the open. Richard made his decision, and this is where we return to where we began. He called his household knights to him, the finest cavalry in England, men who had served him for years, men who would have followed him into the gates of hell. There were perhaps 100 of them, perhaps more. He told them what he intended. A direct cavalry charge, straight at Henry Tudor. Kill the pretender, end the rebellion, win the battle in a single stroke. His commanders urged caution. His closest advisers told him the ground was treacherous, that the charge was suicide, that a king's place was not at the spearhead of a cavalry assault. They begged him to wait, to hold his position, to see what Stanley would do. Richard of Gloucester, King of England, listened to all of it. And then he put on his crown, his battle crown, a golden circlet fitted over his helmet so that every man on that field could see him, could know exactly who was charging, could not miss or mistake him, and he led his knights down the slope. It was extraordinary. Even his enemies acknowledged it. The Burgundian chronicler Jean Molinet wrote that Richard came as close to Henry Tudor as anyone that day, that he personally unhorsed one of Henry's standard-bearers, a knight named Sir John Shane, a giant of a man who had been expected to be unmovable. Richard cut him down. He drove forward. He was almost there. He was within reach. And then the ground betrayed him. The slope beneath Ambion Hill concealed a marsh, Rue de Moor, the old name for the area, may derive from the reedy, boggy ground. Several of Richard's knights became bogged down. The charge lost its momentum, and at this moment Lord Stanley made his choice. His forces, thousands of men, swept in from the flank, falling upon Richard's cavalry from the side, overwhelming them by sheer numbers. Richard's knights began to fall around him. Some fled. Some were cut down. Richard was surrounded. He was alone in a storm of enemies. Contemporary accounts, assembled with scholarly care from sources on both sides, suggest that he fought with astonishing ferocity. He was not dragged from his horse. He did not surrender. He fought on, swinging his weapon, forcing the men around him to actually kill him, inch by inch, blow by blow, refusing with every breath to yield. He had one last chance. A fresh horse was brought to him, or so some accounts suggest, and the famous line later put in his mouth by Shakespeare, "The desperate cry for a horse," may preserve the kernel of a real moment. But Richard, even then, did not run. He would not retreat from this field. He was the King of England, and he would die as one. The final blows came from multiple directions. Archaeology of his skeleton, discovered beneath a Leicester car park in 2011 and confirmed as Richard's remains in 2013, tells us with brutal forensic precision what those last moments were like. He had multiple severe wounds to the skull. At least 2 were potentially fatal. One was a massive blow to the back of the head, consistent with being struck by a halberd, a poleaxe with tremendous force behind it, after his helmet had been lost or struck off. There were wounds to his face, to his ribs. He was hit repeatedly by multiple weapons by multiple men. Some of the wounds on his skeleton appear to be what forensic scientists call humiliation wounds, inflicted after death or after incapacitation by soldiers venting rage or perhaps making absolutely certain. He was 32 years old. His body was stripped naked. It was draped over a horse like a sack of grain and carried to Leicester, where it was displayed publicly for several days so that all could see that the king was truly dead, that the fighting was truly over. He was buried without ceremony in the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester, a Franciscan friary. No monument was erected. No royal tomb was constructed. The Tudor dynasty, now seated firmly on the throne, had no interest in honoring the man they had displaced. The Greyfriars Church was dissolved during Henry VIII Reformation, and Richard's burial place was lost to memory. He lay beneath the ground for 527 years. And if you have found this story as gripping as we have found it telling, please take a moment right now to hit the like button. It helps more people discover stories like this one, and it genuinely means the world to this channel. Now back to Richard. What do we make of him? History, particularly Tudor history, filtered through the genius of Shakespeare and the propaganda of men who needed him to be a monster, has not been kind. The image of the physically deformed, scheming, nephew-murdering tyrant was constructed with deliberate care by those who needed to justify the usurpation that replaced him. The reality is more complicated, more interesting, and in many ways more tragic. He was a man of genuine ability and genuine principle who came to power through methods that compromised everything he claimed to stand for. He was a reforming administrator who never had enough time or political security to let his reforms take root. He was a loyal man who inspired fierce devotion in those who knew him best and deep suspicion in those who observed him from a distance. He was a king who, when the final test came, proved beyond any possible doubt that his courage was absolute and his pride unbreakable, even when those qualities led him straight into destruction. The Battle of Bosworth did not just end Richard's life. It ended an age. The Plantagenet dynasty, that extraordinary line of kings stretching back to Henry II in the 12th century, kings who had conquered, built, failed, and endured across 300 years of English history, ended in that marsh in Leicestershire. The medieval world was ending anyway. Bosworth simply punctuated it. The Tudors who followed would preside over the Renaissance, the Reformation, the birth of a different kind of England. But something was lost when Richard fell. There is a quality in how he died that transcends politics and propaganda. Whatever you believe about the princes in the Tower, whatever judgment you render on his seizure of the crown, you cannot deny what happened on August 22, 1485. When the moment came, Richard III did not calculate his odds and choose survival. He charged. He fought. He refused, with every sinew and every breath, to accept defeat. In that marsh, surrounded by enemies, with the crown still on his helmet and his sword still in his hand, he was everything a medieval king was supposed to be, and everything the cold, patient, careful world that Henry Tudor represented was already leaving behind. His remains, when they were found and examined, revealed a skeleton that told a story of a man who had lived with real physical pain. The scoliosis was confirmed, significant, the kind of curvature that would have affected his breathing under exertion, that would have made the weight of armor genuinely grueling. And yet he had fought, battle after battle, campaign after campaign, and then that final charge on a warm August morning, into the spears and swords of an army that outnumbered him. He was reinterred in 2015, given the ceremony that was never granted him in life at Leicester Cathedral. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the procession. The coffin was carried under the eyes of a silent, respectful crowd. There were flowers. There were tears. 5 centuries after he was dragged naked from that battlefield, England finally said goodbye to its last Plantagenet king with something approaching the dignity he deserved. And somewhere, in the way the crowd gathered, in the quiet that fell over Leicester's streets, in the flowers placed along the route, you could feel the echo of something ancient and irreducible. The recognition that this man, whatever his crimes and whatever his virtues, had faced the worst moment imaginable with a quality that the human heart, across all centuries and all cultures, cannot help but admire. He did not run. He did not beg. He put on his crown and he charged. That is a legacy no dynasty, no propaganda, and no 5 centuries of silence could entirely erase. If Richard III's story has moved you the way it has moved us, drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know what you think about him. Was he a villain? Was he a victim of history? Was he, perhaps, something in between, a flawed, complicated, brilliant man destroyed by a world that was changing faster than he could adapt? Tell us. This community's conversations are some of the finest on this platform, and we read every comment we can. The fields of Bosworth are quiet now, green and gentle under English skies, marked with a modest heritage site, visited by curious tourists and devoted historians. Stand there on a summer morning and you might almost hear it, the distant percussion of it, the thunder of a cavalry charge, the clash of steel, the cry of a king who had decided, in the last moments of his life, exactly what kind of man he was going to be. Not the kind who runs. Not the kind who surrenders. Not the kind who trades a crown for a horse and a road out of England. The kind who charges forward, alone if necessary, into the impossible odds, with the golden circlet gleaming on his helmet so that every man on that field can see him, can know him, can never say he did not fight. The last Plantagenet. The king who fought until his last breath. Richard III. August 22nd, 1485. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, please share it with someone who loves history. It truly helps us keep making these stories. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Next week, we go even further back in time to another king, another impossible stand, another story of a man who refused to yield when every rational calculation said he should. You will not want to miss it. Until then, stay curious. And remember, history is not just the record of what happened. It is the record of who people chose to be in the moments that made all the difference. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and turn on notification for more historical stories.